So in our previous class, right, we have seen something on Hibernate configuration XML, where the name should be standard, which is hibernate.cfg.xml, right? And if you want to find more XMLs of this type, you can find on the projects folder, which I have already shown it, right? Now, in our previous class, we have already seen till some properties on how actually we can actually set these things, which are very important. Now today we'll see how we can actually access these things inside inside our model classes, or the source class from where we are going to actually get the columns of different tables now, right? Now here, so I have created a model class here which is CLS student's model class. Now there are few things which are very important in Hibernate, right? So model classes are something which represent the columns of all the parameters which you are going to define, right? There can be more than required whatever is required for apart from the database columns which you have. But for sure, if you want to define, or if you want to access the columns from any database, right, you have to define each and every possible column of a database table right in here. So for our example, let's take an example of students table, right, where there is a username, user ID and name as a two columns, and internally there are more values, let's say, right? And what we are doing is we are creating a getter setters for them. Now again here, getter setters for each and every parameter which represents column, right, is important again. Until unless you have a getter setter, right, again it is something like using a bean without getter setter, right? Now here you can give these things in two ways. The first way is that you can directly mention the column name. Let's say you have a table which is like students table, where let's say you have two columns which is user ID and name, right? Let's say these are two columns you have. You can have user ID, any number of user IDs and any number of names. Now here you can see that I have made it. There are one more thing which we have in model class is that you have something called each and everything, whatever we are going to mention are or represent them, right, are called as annotations here. Everything Hibernate will understand through annotations. Now annotations in Hibernate are actually, it starts with @ and then we'll have to give the functional annotation which we want to represent each and everything. Now first annotation which we are going to learn is entity. Now the entity annotation, which is @ entity, will actually make the student class as an entity class or a model class. If you don't mention it as entity, right, now this is a normal class which you can't use as a model class. You can't use them. So I have created the student class inside a package called com.c.models. Right? There's a package and a student. Now this student class I've made it an entity, which means I can use this class as a model mapping class to certain table called students table. Now here, as of now, when I say entity and students, right, which means the table name should be students. Or second thing is that if you want to mention the class name as your class name and you want to map this class to some table which is in database, you can do this, that you have something called an entity. There is only one argument in entity annotation, which is name. You can actually give name here, which is, let's say, students underscore, let's say data, something. Now this will represent the table name, which is called the annotation parameter, right? We'll come to this again in different situations, how to actually use different annotations for different things. We'll come to that. But first let us define how we can actually use this in Hibernate configuration. Until unless you mention that there is a class called students, which is a mapping class or a model class to certain table, right, Hibernate will never understand how to actually interact with that table, right? first thing which what we have seen is creating a simple class where you can actually give all the parameters mapping to the columns of your database. Now, the second step is that defining this class as a model class in Hibernate XML, configuration XML. Now, if you remember in our previous class, we said mapping. This mapping tag, I said we'll be checking out in later classes, right? Now, this is a class where we define all the model classes. Now, the students class, whatever I've defined in com.c.models, right? I've actually defined the same in here, which is com.c.common.students. This will actually give me, okay, it is not common. Okay, you'll have to make sure whatever package is there, you'll have to make sure that you have to do that. Let's say com.c.models.students. Now, this is a class which is a mapping model class, right? And as we gave entity annotation, this is the qualifier of mapping this class as a model class to the Hibernate configuration. This will actually make a student class as a model class. This is the second step. Right? First step is that you have to mention your class, and you have to mention all the parameters required, and you have to make this class as an entity annotated class so that we can actually use them in a configuration, Hibernate configuration. Now, inside this model class, right? Yeah.
Hello? So, is there any other method than annotation for mapping with Hibernate configuration?
Other way in the sense?
Other than annotations, is there any other way of mapping it?
You have to map
in the students in the students.java class.
Yeah.
We have said add entity, right? That is annotation.
Yeah.
So I think annotations has came like they are new in the technology, right? Not that they haven't. They are not from the Hibernate when the Hibernate came out. So that time, like how it was.
Actually, this Hibernate is something. Okay, you're talking about the class annotations, right? Class annotations.
Yeah, that is what. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, if you are using even 2.5 servlet type, right, you will be having annotations.
Okay.
Yeah.
So before that, how they used to map it?
How they used to, in the sense in order to map any model class, right, you have to have an annotated entity class. That is for sure. You should have an annotated entity class. If you're using Hibernate 3.0 or above, or even before, I mean the older classes, right, the common mapping will be this mapping class actually. Right? This was the way how we actually map the model class with this. Now, if you don't give this entity, right, actually the thing is I haven't tried out apart from this entity actually, because this is something which we can create out of a library. Now, normally, see this entity class. See, you are talking about servlet annotations, I hope, right? You are talking about servlet annotations.
I'm just curious, like what was there before entity, like the mentioning annotations?
No, annotations were there from JDK 5 itself. Annotations were there from 5 itself. Now, but if you take an example of servlets, right, in 2.5 there was no full-fledged annotations to represent a direct mapping of servlet. It actually came up from 3.0, right?
Okay.
So, but these annotations are Java annotations actually. I'm not talking about servlet annotation, right? You have to give, and obviously in order to map that, you have to make it as an entity class. And entity annotations, everything are there in here. And one more thing is, these entities are there, right? There are two types of entity which you can define actually. Either you can define Hibernate annotation directly, right? Which is deprecated actually. You can see here, you have two. Even maybe this is the one which when there was no entity annotation in Java, right? Maybe ordered Hibernate was the one which people used to use, right? But actually you can see it's a deprecated one. That is why we normally use Java x.persistence. Now this is the one which is a Java's annotation directly, which you can use for so many things, right? Now that is why we have imported javax.persistence entity, right? So have you used anything else, Ujjwala? Okay. So yeah, okay, that is the one. And this annotation, right, this ID, normally this ID is something which is a annotation for primary key, right, or a unique key. Actually, if you mention any column as an ID, right, two things happen. So when table gets created, right, automatically this user ID column will become a primary column and a unique, so it will be auto incremented, right? And other columns will be as per the data type you have mentioned. It will the database column will actually map to the same data type which you have mentioned. So that is what happens, right? We do have more annotations to define other columns too. We'll come to that later, right? And one important thing is that you should have getter setters for each and every column parameter you're actually mentioning in a model class. And this is how we normally go ahead with mapping a model class to the Hibernate configuration, right? Because we are not going to call each and every time these connections, because we have a direct Hibernate APIs to directly call the properties, whatever we have defined, right? So that is the reason why we are going to see how we can actually directly call these different settings of databases and creation or updation of different database tables, right? So this is how we normally create a model class. Now let's see different things here. Now these are column names. As I said, this is something which is a table name, right? Now if you mention anything which is of parameter name, right, then Hibernate will not consider the class name as a table name. It will actually take up the name of an entity parameter. Same way, we also have entity annotation entity annotation for column names too, column parameters which you have defined, right? So let's say I'm going to define this user ID, right? You can give multiple annotations for each parameter as such. So as is each column we have, right? Let's say we have something called column annotation here. You can see column, right? So you can make, if you want a name here, right, name you can make it as let's say I'm going to give it as student underscore ID, right? So this is a column which I have used for this user ID. Now this user ID is qualified for two things. First thing is that there is a primary key, and second thing is that the name of this column will be a student ID and not user ID. Same way you can define things for this. You can just say column here, let's say name as student. Normally we give columns as caps, right? Student underscore name, let's say, right? This is how you can give, and you can give multiple columns here, and just say if you have something called nullable, right? Now if you want to make it as a nullable, you can actually go ahead as nullable. Okay, sorry, you have to give it outside. This is a column. You can give column of something called this one, length. If you want to mention the length, right, how many characters it has to take, you can make that. And unique, if you want to make it unique, you can make it unique as true or false, right? In the same way, you have something called, if it is a price one, you can actually make it as a precision. There are all different things which you can actually go for column annotation. Now these are something which are for columns, right? So either here you can actually mention the column annotations, or if you want, you can directly mention the annotations for direct getter setters. Whenever anyone want to get, right, getting in the sense whenever it gets created, whenever Hibernate creates a table. Now why I'm actually continuing saying create is, if you can see here, as defined in our previous class, right, we just said create in our HP2 DDL auto, right? So this is a command which Hibernate API will take to perform some action. If it is a create, which means what happens is it will actually drop the old table, right? And it will actually create a new table with all the things whatever you have defined in your model class. That is what happens, right? And if you want to create it once and update after that, right, then obviously you have to go for update. But normally, if you want to use an existing database and you want to do DML operations using Hibernate, right, then you always keep it as update. Otherwise, your table will actually, it will drop your table and it will create new table. Now, this is something if you don't have interconnections between your tables, right? Relations, I'm sorry. The relation, if you don't have a table which is a relational table with other tables, right, then it will be dropped, right? If there are any foreign key operations which will actually stop you from deleting any table, right, then yes, your program may crash on that, right? That's why if for existing tables, and if you are using anything on existing tables and you just want to retrieve and something, you can just go for update, so that whatever DML operations you are planning for this model class, right, only update thing can happen. So initially let's keep it as a create. Anyways, we are not going to run it on any database on that, right? So that's fine. Now this is how you can actually go ahead and create a model classes in Hibernate, right? And if you want to define more columns, as database architecture changes, right, you have to only touch this model class, because this model class you can use in so many source classes as a student's student object, which means you are indirectly actually accessing your student data table. If there is any change, you don't, here we normally have something called, if there is any change in table architecture, right? So wherever you write query, everywhere we have to change, either we have to delete a column or add a column or update the name of column, something you have to update. Now here just do it in one model class and everything else will be updated. That is why we always use something called uh, column annotation, right? Because you can keep your parameter name as same, but whenever there is a column name change, you can just change the annotated parameter name. You can keep that. So that is where you actually, that's why we normally use this. Instead of parameterizing it, give your own nomenclature for parameter, but you use annotation of column to give the column name, right? You can actually give it over here, or you can actually give this whenever you have a getter here, right? You can actually give these annotations for even getters, because this is something which is returning your name and ID, right? But normally we give it for direct parameter itself. That's fine, you can use. So this is a very simple model class which we have, right, which we can actually create Hibernate, and you can actually multiply this for any number of columns and any number of type of annotations you want to use in Hibernate, right? Now let us see how we can actually use this model class and actually create or update database table with different values, right? So after model class, the third step was configuring your model class with a mapping tag. Now this mapping tag will be with the current session factory again, right? Now this session factory will hold good for this database details, whatever database details we have. Now why do you have this configuration file is again, now you don't have to actually compile this XML again and again. If you have any change, right, you can just change this configuration directly without deploying anything. And for your information, normally we always go for API kind of thing in web applications, right? If you want to integrate this with any web, right, we normally how we do that is either we'll be actually doing this in a web service or API, where that API will be used in a web service. That is how we normally use. It is not sometimes, so most of the times we'll be using in this way. In most of the times it will be a third tier layer which will be using to interact with database, where your web service will be integrated with this Hibernate API, which will be talking to database, and database after retrieving the data into Hibernate API will be sent through web service to the application. That is how we normally go ahead with the Hibernate model. because you don't want to expose any of the XMLs or anything to the outside world if you just configure them in your application, right? So that's why we normally go ahead with the backend process itself most of the time. And and this is more optimized actually. Why? Because if you use this in an application, right, normally what happens, the application layer will actually try to connect using this JDBC, right, which we have used. Then obviously it will again increase your pooling the database, right? So for that you can actually go ahead with intermediate layer, second layer or second tier, where you can actually give an access to database directly through a web service or something. Okay, so now let's go ahead and see how we can actually use this connection to get into database, and how can we actually do different updations or creation to the table. Now I've created one more class called Hibernate SAM here, com.tree.hibernate. Now this is my main class where I'm actually have this class as a trigger class, right? So in this, what I've done is I've actually created something called an object of student. Now this creation of object of student is a normal object which I've created, right? So this has nothing to do with I'm actually using any Hibernate configuration or anything. No, I haven't used anything on that, right? Now I'll actually show you where exactly I'll be mapping this object, so that this object will be mapped to the mapping entity class where I'm actually using it here, right? Now here